I feel that I just must make the point that this is only a minor story in a huge complex of stories, and that each story, even from the same place, can have different points of view. And in order to get to what can be historical fact, you need to have various stories. My name is Agnes Klein. When the war broke out fully, I was 3.5. We lived in a small, not so such small town. It was a small-ish town by current standards. Up in the Carpathian Mountains, the name was called Brasov, Kronstadt, Brașov in Hungarian. It was in the mountain areas, and it was known to be the winter resort area where the royal family went during the winter time to ski and for sports. And it was well known for winter sports and the like. That's where I was born, and that's where my parents lived at the time. That's not where they came from. They came from other parts of Romania, Transylvania, and all of those areas. One of the fortunate things in that town is that when Transylvania was devolved to Hungary, somehow the cutoff line left that town within Romania. So that was one really plus and fortunate thing. My father was a chartered accountant before the war broke out and discrimination came, or overt discrimination came in. He was the chief accountant for a textile factory, large, probably the only textile factory by the name of Bucharest, that was in what is now Moldova. And it was actually, they processed woolens and textiles in a very much British fashion, so the quality that was produced was very high. When he was traveling a lot, and so when he got married, what he did is he opened an affiliate in the town where we lived, and he ran that as an independent or a semi-independent business. My mother at that point was a housewife. She had gone to university in Budapest to study law in mid to late 20s, and she actually turned tails and ran because there were two things. One of them is there was a quota on Jews, and a couple of people called her a dirty Jew, and she said, nobody's going to call me a dirty Jew, turned tails and went back home. I have a younger sister. She was born in June of 1940. She actually was born 15 minutes after midnight into June 11th. Paris was declared an open city before midnight, just before midnight. Or in other words, about 20 minutes before she was actually born. My father had a daughter, he wanted a son, he got a daughter, and when he went to see my mother in hospital, he allowed her to believe that he was sad because she had had another girl, because he didn't want to tell her that the world situation had deteriorated to a point that he saw no return. And my father had a very good political nose. In fact, his aim had been to do political sciences, get a PhD in political sciences and become a diplomat. And then family circumstances and other things precluded that one. And when my sister was born and my grandparents came from their town to our town, And also my mother's, one of her brothers, who was an obstetrician gynecologist, came to visit with his family after I was born. My father begged them to stay there, and they said, no, we're going back home. He said, I have my practice there, nothing's going to happen. It's more likely that the Romanians are going to persecute the Jews and then the Hungarians are going to be, and there was no way he could keep them there. And of course he was right. They were wrong, and there were some people in our town, some Jewish families in our town, who came from different parts of the country, who went back to the north and northeast portions of Transylvania, some from my mother's hometown, some from some of the other larger townships, who said they would be safer there than in Romania, and actually they all perished. At that point in time, we were already living in a house that had been divided into 2 levels. The bedrooms became one apartment and the downstairs became another apartment because already there were some discriminatory things, and we were able to stay in that place because the chief editor of the local newspaper was my father's best friend. He was actually a Roma, a Romanian Roma. Very well educated, very distinguished gentleman, and journalists in those days were very well educated, highly respected, and my father sold nominally that home, the home to him. We divided it into 2. We moved upstairs, and the downstairs was rented, and they paid, I don't know, whoever paid him rent, whoever was down there. It was all this one family who stayed there all along. It was to protect us from having property confiscated. The area where we were was not that bad, wasn't that bad. And we mostly were restricted to the street where we lived on. One of my mother's friends' daughter was actually practically living with us. This little girl got lice, and I remember my mother cleaning her lice rather than her own mother. And so she virtually lived in our place for about 3 to 4 months. We basically grew up together as a result, and she's actually a hematologist in Hamilton now, through a long series of going from place to place. As time went on, at around the time that I was about 4 by this time, my mother, so the following September, so we're starting September of 40 or so on, there was no longer potential and possibility for having a Jewish school going, so my mother ran an underground. So what basically happened is that I was going to a Montessori kindergarten. Montessori kindergarten was not a Jewish Montessori kindergarten. Today you can do that. In those days that was not done. There was one in town. I went to that kindergarten, and I was they told my mother to take me out because I was Jewish. And so she collected all the Jewish kids who were in that Montessori kindergarten and ran a kindergarten at home. I had finished grade 1. I was not in school until grade 4 again. Towards the end of the school year, we were in another building that had nothing to do with the school building, and where the Jewish Community Center and the compound was. They had rented some premises on the ground floor of an apartment building, and that's where the day school was being run from. I just remember my parents being always worried. You know, my mother also kept us as close as possible, because I think she was quite afraid. She was cleaning the apartment, and my father was in hiding, and the iron guard was looking for him, and my mother had very heavy, very thick hair, so when she cleaned and dusted, she used to put a scarf around her head, and most of the maids wore a scarf like that, and so she pretended that she was the maid and didn't know who he was or where he was. There is a very interesting story tied to Canada. My father had an immigration, was one of the rare Jews who had an immigration permit in the early 1940s to Canada. He actually had gone to Bucharest to pick up his visa. He had some papers to do, he did the papers. And they said, you have to come back next week for your visa, for your immigration permit. He decided that he wasn't going to wait for a week there. And he sent a message with somebody who was coming back home, because not everybody had phones at that point, and said, I will be home shortly because I can always go back and claim my visa. That actually saved his life, because the Jews in Bucharest were rounded up and ghettoed. That was one of the most egregious things, and there were some massacres in the process. That was one of the most egregious things that ever happened in Romania, directly like that, against the Jews. It was around the time that the bombing started, and I think some of it was for safety, some of it was for preservation. And my father, who had from his days as the accountant for the textile factory, gone to had been traveling around the country a fair amount and knew a lot of people. And as I like to say, and as my mother always liked to say, there was almost no one in the country who didn't owe him something in some way. My father looked for us to be kind of safe in one place, and they were not very willing to accept us and receive us, and there were rapid movements of people from all over, and this particular village, which he thought would be safe, the mayor said, no, we're not taking any people refugeeing at all. We had some belongings. I don't remember how much. Couldn't have been too much because we were mostly traveling by cart or by bus or by foot or whatever. We had no food, and nobody wanted to sell us any food. And then a woman came up and gave my mother half a loaf of bread and said, there was rationing, obviously, and we didn't have our ration cards. And she said, here is half of my loaf of bread for you and your children. So she forever appreciated that. She forever talked about how, all you need is a kind word like that to make a difference. My father made some arrangement. He knew this farmer who actually happened to be the mayor of the village, and he said, would you be willing to shelter my family? And he said yes, so we were there. And we were quite fine there. Nobody bothered us or anything. And my father was coming and going between the city and the village. My immediate family, my mother's brother, who was the obstetrician gynecologist, survived. There's some extraordinary stories that were told to him. My mother found out that he survived because people were coming back from concentration camp and they were saying, your brother saved my life, your brother saved my life this way and that way. His daughter perished, his wife perished. From my mother's side of the family, there was hardly anybody left. From my father's side of the family, his siblings survived. Some of them were sent to forced labor in areas that were not that far away. My father's youngest sister, so the youngest in the family, ended up in Dachau, contracted typhus, but she was in the part of Dachau that got liberated by the Russians. And because she had survived, the Russians, however, were sick with typhoid fever, they were typhus at the end of the war. If they had survived the acute phase, they were taking them to Russia. So she was taken to Russia. And then she came from there back home to Romania. So by 1945 or thereabouts, when people were starting to trickle back, she came back around that time. My mother had siblings in Uruguay, and they got an immigration permit for us. We also had a legal quote-unquote affidavit or migration permit to what was still Palestine at the time. We could have chosen Palestine, we chose which became Israel subsequently, about a year later, or we chose South America. And somehow we said, well, let's go where mother's relatives are. So that's how we ended up there. When we were in South America for about 2 years, this envelope full of wax stamps had been running around the entire world looking for us for an immigration permit to Canada. And my father always had this ambition that he wanted to see me end up in Canada, because I spoke French and I spoke English, and you speak all of those languages, and you can manage very well anywhere you go, and I think it's a good place for you to go right now. I had no intention. My intention was, as soon as I graduated out of medical school, I was going to go to Israel, because we had quite a few relatives there. And then what happened is that I got married, and my husband was already living in Toronto, so I came to Canada. I have a husband who's been through the mill. He was in concentration camp, he was liberated out of Dachau, he was in Buna, he did slave labor. He can no longer speak for himself. I made the argument to him that he needs to leave a legacy, and that's the best legacy he can leave behind. I'm not sure that what I'm leaving as a legacy with this story is that important, because I was young and I always felt sheltered enough by my parents. But I think that stories need to be told, because otherwise you give fodder to the Holocaust deniers. And on a personal level, because he can no longer speak for himself, I feel that I just must make the point that this is only a minor story in a huge complex of stories, and that each story, even from the same place, can have different points of view. And in order to get to what can be historical fact, you need to have various stories. And it's an important historical fact, because it needs to be an object lesson for the future for humanity. So those are the reasons why, or else I would have never done it. And I've been kind of pushed by a lot of people to go ahead and do it, but frankly, I think that what we had was very minor compared to many others.